Seem a shine. Do you agree with Mayor Dagan that this is a situation in which Israel should take the initiative and there are opportunities here for Israel to get engaged in he gave the example of the Arab League plan?
First of all, I always agree with him since he was my boss, and let me just say some words, not about the Palestinian issue, but another issue which I think is much more relevant for the last days, and I think it might have within it a contribution to the Middle East that might change perhaps things. I want to say some words about, and then I will also answer your question briefly. I want to say some words about what happened in Iran because I think it's very interesting. We are 4 days after the elections in Iran. 4 days that is too early to evaluate, but it's very interesting to characterize. I was reading hundreds of articles in the last 4 days. Half of them are quoting Rouhani 10 years ago, or in the 5 years ago, or 7 years ago, and he is very terrible, saying all the wrong things that we want from a leader that wants to bring a change. The other half of the articles are giving the huge hope for a change. He will change everything. He will come to terms with the US. He will have a deal on the nuclear issue, etc., etc. And the question, of course, which I think is very important, where is Iran really going? I think that might change the whole Middle East much more than other things that would happen in Syria, for instance. I don't have an answer to that because we are 4 days after. He is not the president yet. August, he will only start to be a president and will have a government and everything. But I want to say some words that I think are very important. First of all is, what does it mean that the people have gave him more than 50% in one round and voted for him? Did they think that he is the reformist that will change Iran? I don't know. But I know that people in the rallies, when he was talking to people, were saying, now Mousavi has his vote, the vote that in 2009 the leadership took from Mousavi, now we gave it to Rouhani. That means that, first of all, the public has said to the leadership, we are fed up with you. We want something else. And I think the most difficult burden that he has on his shoulders is to satisfy these more than 18 million people that voted for him. How is he going to do it? On one hand, I think first of all and foremost, it is his internal agenda. He is beginning to talk about lifting censorship on expression, allowing women's more freedom, the minorities that were voting for him in large numbers. And this is one very important agenda. But, and this is the big difficulty that he is facing, the economy is in a terrible situation. It's going to be more difficult in Iran. In July, we have more sanctions. Situation is going to be worse. The combination between the way you cannot disconnect the economy from sanctions and from the nuclear project means that he will not be able to improve the economy, even if the management will be better, if he doesn't come to terms. And here is a big question mark. I think the room of maneuver for Rouhani is very small. He cannot do a lot. We had today the newspapers, in the Israeli newspapers, talking about the 20%. This is something I want just to say, this is something that the Iranians have said in the previous time also. But here you have to see, this is the example for what Israel is saying, that we don't have to rush after just words, because they are talking about something that is not very important, and they want to get for that the removal of sanctions, which is, of course, impossible.
And if you can just relate to my question.
I would. I think there is no doubt that Israel has to initiate, no doubt. I think the problem with Israel is that we have a problem on our northern border in Lebanon, in Syria. We have a question of the Palestinians with the Kerry initiative now. We have a problem with nuclear Iran. We cannot hide it. And the question is whether Israel can have an answer, a good answer on all these fields. And are all these fields connected? Whether if Israel does something with the Palestinians, does it mean that the situation in Syria will be better? Does it mean that the nuclear program will stop? I think that is the difficulty that I wanted to show, that the Israeli situation, by sitting and not always doing everything, has a sense in what we are doing.
Ambassador Rabinovich, do you agree with that?
Okay. Just a brief comment on Iran and then direct response to the question. I think Sima put it correctly. If the supreme leader and the inner core of the regime did not wanted or did not want Rouhani to be elected, they could have repeated what they did in 2009. But they know that there is enormous pressure building up in Iran. They need to release the domestic pressure, and they need to put a better face towards the world. And I think reluctantly they understood that they have to accept it. Now, with regard to our issues, I agree. The one area in which we can take an active step and conduct active policy is the Palestinian issue. And here is the problem. The time is not ripe right now for a final status agreement. And no Israeli Prime Minister is going to put on the table, let's say, the Olmert proposal of September 2008. According to Abu Mazen, this is where he wants to. This is where he wants to start, and therefore it becomes a non-starter. Logically, one should look at, let's say, an interim agreement, something that may be acceptable to the current Israeli government and could get the ball rolling. As Ambassador Kerzer said, you've got to start somewhere, but this is not acceptable to Abu Mazen. So here is the diplomatic challenge both to the US and Israel. How do you, in this complex reality, find a way to move forward without trying to force the issue on a final status agreement and fail, and overcoming the sensitivities of the Palestinians? Offering them $4 billion looked almost like a bribe, was not the best idea in the world. And now a word about your question, read the Arab Peace Initiative. We never responded to the Arab Peace Initiative, but the Arab Peace Initiative itself may not be relevant in its original formulation to the current circumstances. For instance, it speaks about a return to the 1967 borders. It means it doesn't apply just to the Palestinians, it also applies to Syria. Does anybody in their right minds expect an Israeli government today to speak about a withdrawal from the Golan in the current circumstances in Syria? Obviously not. So we need to open a dialogue with leading Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, that was the leading force in the Arab Peace Initiative, and say, we want to talk, we are willing to respond, but you cannot just put 5 lines on the table and say, take it or leave it. Let's start a dialogue.
Ambassador Gold, what do you think about that? Is the time not ripe for an agreement with the Palestinians? Is John Kerry wasting his time?
Well, I don't know what Secretary of State Kerry is saying in private meetings with the Prime Minister of Israel or with Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah, but I think here at this table, I agree with what Ambassador Rabinovich is saying, that the time is not ripe for a full final status agreement. Now, as much, by the way, much of what Mayor Dagan said, I agree with. There is a change in parts of the Arab world where we have a similar strategic outlook that we should try and build upon. It's interesting, we're at a conference that comes on Shimon Peres's birthday, our president's birthday. In the 1990s, when people thought of new developments, a new Middle East, peacemaking, and they looked to the European model, they thought of economic integration, and the entire approach was economic. And there was the Casablanca meeting right after, in 2004, I believe, 1994. I think the different Middle East we have today is one in which Israel and several Arab countries have similar threat perceptions. And if you look at the origins of Europe that we think of as a model, the European Union grew not out of the coal and steel community alone, but out of the common threat they faced from the Soviet Union. We are facing 2 common threats. One, the Iranian threat, and the second one, the threat of the Muslim Brotherhood. And if we are smart, we can build some foundations of dialogue with key Sunni Arab countries. That, unfortunately, will have to be kept very quiet. and you can't get credit for it on the editorial page of either the Jerusalem Post or the New York Times. But it's the right thing to do.
Ambassador Rabinovich wanted to make a comment.
Yeah, one small addition. Saying that the time is not
Press the
ripe.
button again.
Saying that the time is not ripe now for a final status agreement is not identical to saying that the two-state solution is dead. I think that
I think you have to push the button again.
I think that it's damaging for senior Israeli politicians and political leaders to say time and again that the two-state solution is dead. Ambassador Kerzer is a gentleman. He made only an indirect reference to a statement about pieces of shrapnel in the back parts of one's anatomy. But for a senior minister in the Israeli cabinet to refer to the Palestinian issue in this language is damaging, and this is exactly the kind of statements we should not be making.
All right, Ambassador Kerzer, that will put the ball back in your court. Go ahead.
Let me be a little bit less gentlemanly and disagree with two people I respect very much. Why isn't this a time to try for a final status agreement? Why isn't it a time? And, you know, it's a dream. Of course it's a dream, but there are realistic possibilities that need to be explored. And I'll give you two concrete examples. One that Mayor Dagan very helpfully introduced. People here and in the United States have tended to look at the Arab Peace Initiative through the prism of its details. And there are aspects of those details which are problematic from Israel's perspective. If you step back, however, and understand the context of this initiative, in a sense, it represents the victory of Zionism. Why do I say that? Because in 2002, when this initiative came forth in Beirut, the Arab world abandoned the idea that Israel's existence should be called into question and focused all of its attention on the occupation of Arab territories in 1967. Now, the details of how to deal with that occupation are problematic, and that's what has involved the peace process. But in a sense, the Arab world basically threw up its hands in 2002 and said, "You are here to stay." The iron wall of Jabotinsky had been breached. You won. And yet everybody looked at the details, paragraph 2, paragraph 3, paragraph 4. Sure, the details are going to be critical when we get into negotiations. But the Arab world is now ready to deal with the state of Israel within certain parameters, within certain borders, within certain understandings. This is the victory of the Zionist dream. So if we only focus on paragraph 2, sure, it's easy to say we can't deal with this, or it's not the time to try to reach an agreement. But if we step back and we look at the readiness of the Saudis who put forward this initiative, the Jordanians who drafted it, and the rest of the Arab world who came on board, why wouldn't we try to get to a final status agreement now? Number one. Number two, we have a bitui. We have a saying, which I suppose also exists in Hebrew. If you're digging yourself into a hole which is a problem, the first thing you do is stop digging. So let's say that you don't agree with me. Let's say you agree that this is not the time for a final status agreement. It's a legitimate point of view. Why would you keep digging that hole deeper with settlements? Why are you making this problem? Why are you exacerbating this problem every single day? Now, one could make the argument, well, this is a bargaining chip, and at some point we may not, we may withdraw. You're talking about people's lives. You're talking about the people who are moving into these houses with the expectation that the government of Israel supports them being there, and no expectation that they're a bargaining chip, and you are complicating the very agreement that you say you seek with the Arab world. So at a minimum, don't dig yourself further into the hole, even if you believe, or maybe especially if you believe, that this is not the time for a final status agreement. I think people are tending to look at this issue entirely backwards. They're looking at details instead of, as I said earlier, the eagle's perspective. When you step back and realize that these changes in the Arab world that may be coming, problematic changes, but there also may be possibly positive changes. Mayor Dagan pointed, for example, to some of the unexpected benefits of the Morsi government in Egypt. Who has worked hardest to destroy the smuggling tunnels between Sinai and Gaza? It wasn't Israel during its occupation of Gaza, and it wasn't the presidency of Mohammed Hosni Mubarak. It's the presidency of Mohammed Morsi. They're flooding these tunnels for Egyptian purposes, but this is good for Israel. Who's working with Israel on strategic understandings to deal with their own security? Step back, please, and understand that A, it is possible that this is exactly the time to go for a final status agreement, but B, even if you don't agree with that, stop making the situation worse.
Thank you. Dory Gold, you wanted to make a comment before I get to you, Mayor. Please, can you be brief? Are we digging ourselves into a hole?
Look, I don't want to get into the settlements issue because that's another half hour. I want to speak on something very specific, which is the Arab Peace Initiative. Look, the spirit behind the Arab world reaching out to Israel is something positive. The problem with the Arab Peace Initiative, and I refer to the statement made by Saud al-Faisal, the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia, in 2007. He was asked, is it a take or leave it initiative, or is it negotiable? If it's negotiable, let's negotiate. But if it's take it or leave it, here it is. You can't even take the refugees and put them in Lebanon or in Jordan because it says you can't, there's a whole prohibition about them receiving Arab nationality outside of Palestinian territory, Tautin. So what I'm trying to say is this: it would be great if this was the basis for sitting down and we can bring our positions to the table and they can bring their positions to the table and we can talk about it. We have to reach a deal with the Palestinians in any case. But unfortunately, as much as people get very excited about the Arab Peace Initiative, we're not there yet.
Mayor Dagan, I'm guessing you're going to disagree with that.
Naturally, I disagree with it. I think there's a necessity for Israel to start a dialogue, a serious dialogue with the Palestinians. I think that to damage it by creating there is not a chance to reach an agreement is damaging to Israel. I think it's a necessity of doing so. I know that to reach a final agreement with the Palestinians, it's not going to be an easy process. And naturally, there are very serious open questions that it will take a great deal of time to solve them. And you cannot really solve them directly with the Palestinians. You need to, it's a necessity to bring the Arab world. I think that we have to take the initiative, to take the spirit of the idea that the Arab League is willing to accept the state of Israel into existence. I think this is the most important factor of the Saudi initiative. The Saudi initiative, original one, was a very favorite one. They didn't discuss in detail. It was not referred to the Board of 67. It was much more, it was given in a, what I call a press conference with dialogue. It was never official. Later, it was taken by the Arab League, and then it was translated to something that it was very hard to live with. But I think that with the rest of the Arab world, because they have a necessity to present a different alliance in the Middle East, and they understand the obstacle of the Palestinian issue. If I'm taking Abu Mazen have an opposition in his own community, without creating something that will providing a backing by the Arab world, he is unable to sign. Even the proposal that was presented by Olmert, he didn't sign it. He didn't sign it not because he didn't want to. He felt uncertain by the support that he is going to receive by the Palestinian community, and he didn't receive what I call a very strong backing of the Arab League and the most important Arabic countries. I think that we maybe, strategically, we have to start to bring with the rest of the Arabic world before we bring the Palestinians. Why? Because in this aspect, we have much more common interests on very important strategical issues. And then by achieving something that could align with what I call the interests of Israel, then you might reach a final agreement with the Palestinians. And I think I agree with Ambassador Kerzer. What the meaning of it? It's not the time. When will be the time? Should we wait till the Hamas will take over in the West Bank? This will be the time. This will be a worst-case scenario. We'll be upon ourselves a serious enemy. Today, at least, you have a Palestinian Authority that at least they have a goal to establish a free Palestinian state and what I call organized border, and they are seeing the Hamas as a threat. If we are going to continue and nothing is going to achieve, we have to take in consideration that the one who is going to take and to win the election inside the Palestinian camp is going to be the Muslim Brotherhood, the Hamas. I think this is a worst-case scenario for Israel, and the sooner to be engaged in a dialogue with the Palestinians is better, for the interest of Israel.
I think our panelists have all made very interesting statements. Their positions are clear. We're going to open it up now for 15 minutes to the audience. Please, can you turn the lights on? And I'll take a question from the front here. This gentleman, where's the microphone? There should be a microphone somewhere. Okay, sir, can you stand up in the front?
Thank you. Jerry Lewis. Two-pronged question.
Could you address it to a specific person?
I would like the panel to
Not
give
the whole panel, one specific person.
Okay. I think maybe Dory Gold would like to comment on the suggestion, why doesn't Israel just call the Palestinians bluff, offer them a 6-month settlement freeze, and demand that they come to the table, and if they don't, the world would see who is really not prepared to negotiate. And the other question, I think, to Itamar Rabinovich, if I may, there is a lot of talk, especially in Europe, and I come from Britain, of more pressure on Israel. The British Foreign Secretary, William Hague, has talked of incentives and disincentives. The EU are planning, as I understand it, to become far more rigorous in their opposition to settlements. What should Israel do?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dory.
Briefly, we did this. The State of Israel offered a settlement freeze. It may not have been perfect, it may not have been exactly what the Palestinians wanted, but the United States recognized that it was a real freeze. And did we engage? Did it turn into a negotiation? Maybe Mahmoud Abbas doesn't want a negotiation right now. Maybe he looks at the region. In the old days, you know, Mahmoud Abbas could sit down with Osama el-Baz and President Mubarak, and they'd give him advice and give him support. Well, now, you know who's in control of Cairo? The sponsors of his enemies in Hamas. So it's a much more difficult region, not just for us, but for him. And so I think we've got to also understand that the settlement issue shouldn't be overrated. And by the way, on this, there was an amazing piece in the New York Times Magazine, an interview with Mahmoud Abbas a few years back. I don't remember the name of the interviewer. He's an academic from Canada. And the settlement issue came up. And Abbas said, you know what? The built-up areas of all the settlements come to 1.2% of the West Bank. And he said, and I offered Olmert a 1.9% land swap. In other words, I was more generous with him than he actually needed. But he was trying to say that the combination of the amount of territory taken by the settlements, from his perspective, whether he's right or not is another question, wasn't terribly great. The settlement issue was built up by various international players. So let's not overrate it today. Arafat came to Washington to have Abu Mazen sign the Oslo agreements in 1993 without a settlement freeze. Keep that in mind. Put this in perspective. There are far more important issues that are affecting the peace process than construction in the West Bank.
Okay, let's first have Itamar answer the second part of the question.
Indirectly and then directly to your question. Both in my diplomatic and academic capacity, I had many European diplomats ask me, why aren't you interested in having us take a more active role in peacemaking in the Middle East? And, you know, I used to say what I used to say. When I get this question next time around, I would say, just think of what happened on the Israeli-Syrian border a week ago when a few fires were shot and the Austrians took back the peacekeeping force in the Golan Heights. So Europe is problematic in these regards, but you know, we are losing the legitimacy battle. We lost the moral high ground. The boycott, the BDS movement is gaining force. Stephen Hawking is not an isolated or a meaningless case. So we have to deal with that. Number one, from my point of view, don't expand settlements, very simply. Nothing irritates the world more than settlement expansion. Number two, you speak about Hasbara, you have to improve our Hasbara. You know, you could put 10, 15 very eloquent Israeli spokesmen on CNN, BBC, whatever, and then when an Israeli minister stands up and says, oh, when the Prime Minister says two-state solution, I know that it doesn't mean what he says. What is that going to do to our position in Britain? So this charity begins at home.
Thank you. Next question, sir, over there. Jerry, can you pass the microphone? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Abe Dorovich, and I'm an average Israeli citizen.
And your question?
It is for the former ambassador,
Dan Kurtzer.
Dan Kurtzer. President Obama has stated that Assad must go, and that the use of chemical weapons is a game changer. At this point in time, the party that's holding all the cards vis-a-vis Syria is not Iran, not Israel, not the Europeans, but the Russians. It's the Russians who are, as far as I know, threatening to keep their hold in the Middle East.
So your question?
Comment on that.
Okay, a comment from you, Dan.
The factors you cited are very important lessons in Diplomacy 101, which is be careful what you say publicly that then becomes a benchmark for what you are perhaps expected to do. And it may be a mistake to articulate a policy unless you have thought through the implications of how you're going to go about achieving it. So in the case of Syria, as I mentioned earlier, the United States, in practice, not so much in rhetoric, is trying to weigh carefully the consequences of all the things that you mentioned. Will there be a fundamental change as a result of Assad staying in power with respect to Iranian and Hezbollah standing? What kind of change would occur should Assad tomorrow disappear from power? In other words, what successor regime will come into power? If we all believed that in a relatively short period of time, a liberal democratic regime would emerge in Syria, you would see American bombers in the air today to get rid of Assad. But you know as well as I, as everyone in this auditorium knows, that there is as much disunity among the Syrian opposition as anywhere else in the world. And it is quite possible that you will have a continuation of a civil war in Syria beyond the removal of Assad, in which you have radical jihadists competing for power with many other factions. Now, in this context, as your question suggested, Russia has very significant interests. And for the past 2 years, the United States and Russia have been involved in an intimate dialogue to see whether or not Russia's interests and America's interests could be aligned in a manner that provides for a reasonable transition in Syria. Unfortunately, until now, we haven't found that combination of interests. But I think the search in Washington continues to see whether or not there is a way where at least these two powers can align themselves in a transition which assures that the interest of both of us, that a radical jihadist regime does not succeed Assad, in fact becomes the outcome.
Thank you. There's a question from a young woman in front here. Third, yeah.
Microphone?
Microphone. If you can address it to a specific panelist, that would help.
Thank you. Caroline Beck. Ambassador Gold described leaving the Jordan Valley as a national disaster, and I would like to hear Mayor Dagan respond to that, please.
Mayor Dagan, is leaving the Jordan Valley a national disaster?
The IDF can protect Israel on any border that the Israeli government will decide. I think it's not that I'm trying to undermine the importance of some pieces of terrain. It's important. But if the political need will be as such, let's say theoretically, that the Jordan Valley will not be in Israeli hands, I think the IDF have a unique ability to protect Israel on those borders. Let's not forget, in 1967, we were sitting on different borders, and I believe that we prevail, not in a bad way, military-wise. I think that to try to use what I call security reasoning for political issue, it's a mistake.
Thank you.
You gotta let me in.
Okay, 2 minutes.
1 month before he was assassinated, Yitzhak Rabin appeared in the Knesset to present the Oslo II interim agreement for approval. And it was a haunting speech because of the timing. But what he did was he laid out what he viewed as the future borders of Israel. With respect to the Jordan Valley, Rabin stated to the Knesset, we're 2 years into Oslo. This isn't a speech from the 70s. 2 years into Oslo. He says, Israel must retain the Jordan Valley in the widest sense of the term. He didn't say whether we had to have sovereignty. I'll admit that. But he made it very clear. This was also the position of Arik Sharon. And when I was asked by Prime Minister Netanyahu to present to President Clinton the IDF security interest map that was done by the planning branch of the Army, it included the Jordan Valley. When Sharon asked me to make a presentation that he presented to President Bush in 2001 on Israel's vital interests, we went to the White House, it included the Jordan Valley. So if Rabin, Sharon, the IDF interest map, which was presented by Bibi Netanyahu in Washington, included the Jordan Valley as a vital Israeli interest, I say it's a vital Israeli interest.
Mayor Dagan.
The fact and the importance of the Jordan Valley, and I'm not trying to present a political aspect, I'm looking from a military point of view, had a great importance till 91. Why? Till that point in time, there existed what I call a conventional threat against Israel, what we used to call the Eastern Front. It's a combination of Iraq, Syria, and in some cases, Jordan might join them. When this scenario was a vivid scenario and a very clear scenario, the importance to be able to engage on the slopes of the Jordan Valley came as a crucial issue, especially if the Iraqis would come. I think if we are looking today on the issue, those threats disappear completely. Iraq have no real effective military. The chances today of Iraq to establish a military treaty with Syria is limited. The chances for King Abdullah of Jordan to join the Eastern Front, I believe, is not existing. Is it important to prevent terrorists of coming in? Yes, but to prevent terrorists of coming in, it's not always a necessity to have direct military presence. If you will have a good cooperation with the Jordanians, and you will have an effective presence that could screen everyone who is crossing the border, you can solve it. I'm not trying to undermine the importance of the Jordan Valley. I'm not presenting a political approach. I'm just trying to present that from the military point of view, if the Israeli army will receive a directive from the government to protect Israel from different borders, the Israeli army is able of doing so.
Okay, I'm afraid we're running out of time. I'm going to give Seema a chance to have a concluding remark. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say a word about, since I agree with my previous speakers on the Arab initiative and on the fact that it could be a basis, even though some of the details are not with the Israeli position. I want to just to illuminate one angle, and that is that when we are saying the Arab initiative, we have also to take into our mind the fact that there is no Arab world. We don't know who will be in Syria. We don't know who will be in Egypt, even though today we have Morsi, but he cannot even have a date for elections for his parliament, and we don't know other things, and I am not sure that Saudi Arabia and Egypt do think the same. 2 days ago, Egypt stopped its diplomatic relations with Syria. So you have to take into account that when we are talking about the Arab initiative, it's mostly Saudi Arabia and Persian Gulf. Might be, of course, Jordan, but might be also Egypt, but I'm not sure that.
Well, we started with Seema and we're going to end with Seema. I'd like to thank you all.